3 days after seizing Majdanek, the Russians were approaching Warsaw. But here the Red Army paused. Stalin now stood ready to do what Hitler had done before: grab land, not in the name of Lebensraum, but of communism. By the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration had ripped the heart out of the German army in the east. The Red Army now paused and dug in along the river Vistula, south of Warsaw. Stalin was in no hurry to bring the war to an end. With Europe in turmoil, conditions were ideal for the spread of communism. The first victims of Stalin's political calculations were the Poles. On August 1st, 1944, the Polish Home Army rose up in Warsaw against its Nazi occupiers. But it desperately needed help. The Red Army, camped just to the south, was perfectly placed to provide it. But Stalin regarded the Polish Home Army as close to the Polish government in exile in London and hostile to communism. So he turned a blind eye to the plight of the Polish for terrible brutality. The Germans wouldn't finally be pushed out of Poland until the Russian army drove them out in January 1945. It was the start of a Soviet master plan that would eventually see communist governments across most of Eastern Europe. To the north, contingents of the Red Army continued to clear the Germans out of the Baltic states. These would later be incorporated into the Soviet Union. Near the Latvian capital of Riga, over 200,000 Germans were trapped behind Russian lines. But Hitler, still determined to hold on to his Lebensraum, refused to countenance a retreat. Even so, gradually the German forces were pushed back to the Baltic coast. By mid-October 1944, the Germans had been squeezed onto the Courland Peninsula, west of Riga. They would remain marooned there for the rest of the war, when they eventually surrendered to Soviet forces. Stalin, meanwhile, was already sizing up other territory in Eastern Europe. He could have moved directly west towards Germany. Instead, units of the Red Army moved south in a vast thrust down through the Balkans. Nearly 1,500 tanks and 1 million men pushed into Romania in late August 1944. The defending Axis forces had less than 400 tanks and just 800,000 troops. Pro-German Romanian troops gave way almost immediately all along the front. Three days later, large pockets of German troops were surrounded near Chisinau. Hitler issued his standard command: no retreat. For 9 days there was bitter fighting. Over 180,000 German troops were killed or taken prisoner. The remainder beat a belated retreat. In late August, Romania's pro-German dictator, Marshal Ion Antonescu, was arrested. Romania surrendered. By the end of the month, the Red Army was in Bucharest and had occupied the strategically important Romanian oil fields. It meant Germany had lost its main supply of oil. 3 Soviet armies now moved south into Bulgaria. Bulgaria had tried to stay neutral, but it too would soon be swallowed up by the Soviet Empire. Meanwhile, the rest of the Russian forces now moved west towards Yugoslavia. German troops to the south, in Greece, faced being trapped. They began a hasty retreat up through Albania and southern Yugoslavia. They were harried all the way by Albanian and Yugoslav partisans. By mid-October 1944, the Red Army had reached the Yugoslav capital of Belgrade. Only now did it begin to swing north and west towards Hungary and then Germany. German reinforcements poured into Hungary to support the pro-Nazi puppet government, but the Red Army ground on. Eight weeks later, it laid siege to Budapest. The siege lasted over 6 weeks before the German puppet government collapsed. By the end of 1944, most of Eastern Europe lay in Stalin's grasp. His troops controlled the Baltic states and Poland, Romania and Bulgaria. Pro-Soviet forces ruled in Yugoslavia and Albania. Hungary and Czechoslovakia were in his sights. Stalin had successfully laid the foundations for the future Soviet bloc. He could now, at last, move on to Germany. But in the West, Allied forces were also approaching the German border. The race was on to be the first to take Berlin.